In 1886, Wilhelm Steinitz became the first world chess champion. 3 years later, the New York Super Tournament of 1889 became effectively the first candidates tournament. The winner would earn the right to challenge Steinitz in a match for his title. This was a grueling, epic event. 20 of the world's best chess players played a double round robin tournament. That means everybody plays everybody twice for 38 rounds. It certainly puts our current 8-player double round robin event with 14 total rounds to absolute shame. Now, over this massive tournament, there emerged two victors. One was Mikhail Chigorin, who had just played a match against Steinitz for the title and had lost and was not interested in a rematch. The other was Max Weiss, a name you probably have not heard of, but he was one of the absolute best players of his day. Now, despite a short and scintillating career, he decided not to challenge Steinitz for the world championship and instead basically just retired to become a very successful banker. The game that we are actually looking at in this event, though, is not a victory by Weiss, a positional player. It is the Brilliancy prize-winning game won by the Irish champion Pollock against Weiss. This is what the world champion Steinitz had to say about the game. Mr. Pollock's play from the 17th move renders this game one of the finest monuments of chess ingenuity, and altogether it belongs to the most brilliant gems in the annals of practical play. A quick note before we get started here, this is my number 15 game of the before 1900s. This is going to wrap up my best of the decade series. As we look at this period before 1900, it contains some of the absolute greatest brilliancies of all time, some real earth-shattering chess. At the same time, although there are some amazing brilliancies, there aren't that many recorded games. So when I look beyond the opera game and the immortal game, it's a little harder to find games to represent the great players of the period. So I decided to do more than a top 10. I decided to do a top 15. It will still be only one game by each player that makes the list, and I hope that you can be introduced to some new games and new players as we go through this top 15. Weiss opens the game here with pawn to e4, and we get a Ruy Lopez. e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, pawn to a6, bishop a4, knight f6, tickling the e4 pawn, which does not need to be defended, but Weiss does play pawn to d3. A very sensible move, if not the most challenging. Weiss was known to be a positional player, but he also did not pursue a professional chess career, and here, even in 1889, it seems like that might have put him at a theoretical disadvantage against his peers, and he might have avoided the most challenging sharp lines. After pawn d3, we see b5 pushing the bishop back to b3, bishop c5, c3, and a sharp move, pawn to d5 from Pollock, not allowing Weiss to just continue development and eventually play d4. He's going to strike first. Now, the Irish champion William Pollock was a regular Brilliancy Prize winner. This is by no means his only Brilliancy Prize winning game. Look at his gameography and you'll find a lot of really, really fun combinations. So this move may objectively not be the best, but it certainly works in this game as his aggressive style throws Weiss off balance. Here we get pawn takes d5 and knight takes d5. At this point, Weiss should just castle. And these positions might look good for black to someone who's unfamiliar with these structures. You might think, hey, this pawn is kind of backwards on the d file. Black has these aggressive pieces, is pretty well developed. But the problem is that, among other things, this bishop is a monster. White has really good use of the light squares, for example, the use of the e4 square, and the e5 pawn is also weaker than the d3 pawn. Rook e1 puts a lot of pressure on the e5 pawn, and you're not going to want to defend that e5 pawn with pawn to f6, because then this bishop really becomes absolutely fierce. So these structures are by no means winning for White, but they are better for White, and honestly, it would be very much in Weiss's positional style to press in this way. Instead, though, he plays queen e2, which is just not the right move here. He's not getting castled, and his idea to go in a pawn, which he does pursue, proves to be significantly erroneous. Here we get castles from Pollock, queen to e4, and we do get an erroneous response here. Now, the engine recommends the move knight d to e7 and says that black is better. Of course, that's all very complicated. One thing I would note, though, is that the queen is likely going to be a target for further tempos here. For example, black is already threatening bishop f5, which would win d3 and creates a lot of problems. So black is better here, but this knight move is kind of unintuitive. Pollock's move, though, is bad, and it's the one really bad move he does make in this game. It's bishop e6, and I've given a question mark because the computer gives a question mark, and the computer's always right, but honestly, I think things aren't quite so simple. The reason the computer hates bishop to e6 is because of knight g5, which is a pretty natural move, of course. You're here attacking the bishop, and you're threatening mate over on h7. Of course, both players should have seen this. What I think the computer appreciates that humans may not appreciate is that after the force sequence g6 and knight takes, pawn takes, and then castles, white is a lot better here. Now, as a human, I don't know that I would naturally think that white is a lot better here. I mean, the doubling of the e-pawns has secured the knight on d5 and kind of blended this bishop a little bit. And I'm looking at the f-file and thinking, hey, what if I double? What if I triple against this f2 pawn? Of course, the computer is fearless, though. It doesn't just look at a position and be like, yeah, it looks kind of good for one side or another. Instead, it's going to calculate and calculate and calculate. And here it's calculating that actually all of the counterplay on the f-file is illusory. If you just bring this knight over to f3, the knight sits on f3. There's no real danger on the f-file, even though a human can certainly still go wrong. And positionally, white is eventually just going to clean up these weak pawns right here. So the computer is saying this is like plus 1.5, nearly winning. Evidently, though, the humans didn't see it that way. I think you and I probably also would not find it so easy to play this and to assess this when given the opportunity to play in this fashion. And the players instead went down a different path, and Weiss here decided to cash in and take the e5 pawn. Knight takes e5. And this is definitely a mistake. White is not castled, and this is too greedy, and Pollock seizes on his opportunity with knight takes e5, queen takes e5. And how should black continue to punish white for trying to capture this pawn without castling? Well, there are a few good moves, but the best and prettiest is the move played knight to b4. Absolutely beautiful. The point of knight b4 is very simple. By moving the knight and creating a huge threat here on d3, you're now simply threatening to capture here on b3 because you've opened up an attack between the bishops, and then you can play rook e8 and you can pin and win the queen to the king that is still sitting on e1. So these tactical threats are a huge problem. For example, if the knight is captured with pawn takes b4 here, then bishop takes b4 check. And if knight c3, for example, then you have bishop takes b3. You've already regained your sacrificed piece, and you're just intending rook over to e8, pinning and winning the queen right here. And in this position, if king to d1, so that you're no longer getting pinned right here, and also the king is allowing the rook to defend the e1 square, because if you went to f1, bringing the rook to e8 would threaten mate on the e1 square. So here you're covering the mates. Black just has a huge attack. Here you can play queen takes d3 check, bishop d2, and you just bring your rooks to the e file and to the d file. And here the computer's saying, nah, white shouldn't be able to hold on. Now, I do think that white should probably have played this way because it's not easy to, succeed with this attack. Black has to play accurately to win, but the computer is very, very skeptical here of white's ability to defend after, for example, queen g3 and then queen d4. Deep analysis really looks like black should be winning, and certainly any human would love to play this position with the black pieces. Instead, though, after knight b4, what we actually get is castles for white, which makes a lot of sense, of course, but now black is just much, much better. Here we have I should point out one other line. After knight b4, there's also another piece hanging. It is this bishop over here, and okay, this isn't too complicated, but you do have a royal fork here, which is very pretty, and you always want to put a royal fork on the board. In any case, though, knight b4, castles for Weiss, so he is at least getting his king out of the center of the board, And now we get knight takes d3, hitting the queen, also defending the bishop on c5, and hitting f2 over here. Now, if queen g3, which does try to defend this f2 square, there's knight takes f2. This is crushing. Rook takes, and you just take on b3 so that there's no defender of the d1 square anymore. And if you're recaptured, queen d1 and checkmate. So Weiss actually pulls the queen over to h5. Now this queen is also defending the d1 square, which is helping avoid some of these mates. And it does mean that Pollock is not able to capture on f2 yet because d1 is defended. Bishop takes b3 now. Pawn takes b3, rook e8, a beautiful rook on the e file. And there are more tactics against f2 now. Knight d2, queen to e7, and pawn to b4, attacking this bishop. And what does that bishop do? Well, it captures on f2. An excellent move here, and there's a classic combination to justify it. If rook takes f2, you have queen e1 check. And now the rook is hit, so it needs to pull back to f1. But then you have queen to e3 check, king over to h1, and we should know this continuation, knight to f2 check. If you give up the rook here, then after queen takes, you're just bringing the rook into e1. It's over. And of course, if king g1, then you have knight h3, double check, king h1, queen g1 check, the classic smothered mate, rook takes, and knight to f2. Beautiful stuff, standard, but always a joy to see on the board. So after bishop takes f2 check, the bishop is ignored. King over to h1, and now queen into e1. A very, very strong and, of course, visual move. Now, we can naturally see you can't take the queen. Rook takes, and it's made on the next turn after the knight blocks and is captured. And here, yes, the rook on f1 is defended. So black is kind of not threatening anything right away if white is careful. But with the queen sitting on e1, everything is tied down. Like this knight can't move because you'll just capture the rook. The rook can't move. These pieces are stuck while the knight is still on d2. So this just freezes the white position. Pawn to h3, the best try. So now you can take the queen on the next turn because you are not getting mated because the king can step up. But Pollock realizes here, actually, you're not threatening to take the queen. Not if I capture your bishop on c1. And he does play knight takes c1, a brilliant move, sacrificing the queen for the rook and that bishop on c1, and commencing basically a mating attack on the dark squares. From here on out, it's just a beautiful king hunt. We now get rook takes e1, which you have to do because this knight here is hanging on d2, and of course the knight can't move because then you're losing this rook on f1, so the only option is to capture the queen. The only option other than resignation anyway. Rook takes e1, rook takes e1 check. The king steps up to h2, bishop to g1 check. Of course, you can't pull back here because, you know, this would win the knight here on d2, and then black is just up oodles of material and the attack continues. So the king must run up the board. King up to e3. I'm sorry, king up to g3. And now here we have rook to e3 check. If the knight tries to block, knight f3, then here we have knight e2 check, and the king is pushed up again, h4, and now bishop to f2 check. And if you block with g3, which makes sense actually because you want to force black to put a piece on g3 to try to give you a little more discoordination in the black camp. Bishop takes g3 check, king g5, and of course the king should not survive here with all of the black pieces around, and the finish here can be h6 check, king f5, and then pawn to g6 check, and you're mating soon, and you're also winning the white queen with this pawn fork. There are actually quite a few ways to win by that point. So after rook e3 check, the king steps up the board, king to g4, and a strong move, knight to e2, which is threatening rook to g3 check here. In this position, there's no time for rook takes g1, trying to give back some material because of rook g3 check, and wherever the king goes, you're going to win the queen here. Of course, if king f5, we again have the pawn fork g6 check, And if king back to h4, then you can win the queen with pawn to g5 check. And the queen must capture because otherwise it would be checkmate. So backing up, after knight e2, we get a clever move from white, knight to f1. Weiss tries this move, which attacks the rook and defends g3. And at this point, we get the one of the best moves, pawn to g6. But at this point, Pollock has to see the finish to the game. If he didn't see the finish, g6 would be a mistake, because the move queen d5 now attacks the rook on a8. And this knight is still attacking the rook on e3. So now we're in a position where it's mate or go home for Pollock. Fortunately, he has calculated the mate. He starts with pawn to h5 check. And now if the king goes to h4, there's a beautiful finish here, bishop f2 check. And now pawn to g3, we'll see basically what would happen after king g5 in the main line of the game. Knight takes g3 here. This is a beautiful move. And in this position, if knight takes e3, picking off the rook, then you have knight to e4, and it's checkmate. The bishop and the knight work together wondrously here. Backing up, we have more beautiful finishes ahead. After h5 check, the king tries to go to g5 instead of h4. And now we get king g7. The black king is in position to finish off the white king. Both rooks are still hanging here, but the idea of pawn to f6 enabled by stepping up with the king is a checkmating idea. Mate and 8 at the most, according to Stockfish. So in this position, let's first consider queen takes a8, picking off the rook on a8. And here we have f6 check. The king is pushed back to h4, bishop f2 check, g3. And here you can capture on g3 with the rook or the knight. Let's play rook takes g3. I think it's a little prettier to give up the bigger piece. Knight takes g3. Otherwise, there are discoveries, and bishop takes g3, checkmate. Again, all of black's pieces work in perfect harmony. So the game actually here saw the other rook get captured, knight takes e3, and in this position, pawn to f6 check, king back to h4, and again, bishop f2 check, g3, bishop takes g3, checkmate. Just an incredible finish here. Beautiful, beautiful king hunt at a momentous tournament featuring two really special players of their era, especially Weiss, who, although he lost this game, one of the best players of his day by far. And I think it's a really interesting what-if question to ask, what would have happened had he played Steinitz in the World Championship match? In any case, it would have been really interesting to see that match between him and Steinitz. It would have been a totally different dynamic than Steinitz versus the fiery Chigorin. I hope that you've enjoyed this game. If you want to see more of my top 15 games from before 1900, then click on that playlist that is popping up on your screen as I speak.